The return bearing was already on my scope when we cleared the jump threshold. That was the first wrong thing. We had dropped into unmapped corridor. No beacons, no relay infrastructure, nothing on the charts except the designation Vethari Null 7 and a standard advisory that the region was under claimed observation by a multi-species compact, whose name we'd seen in 3 footnotes across 2 separate diplomatic briefs, neither of which anyone on the Grael's margin had read in full. The corridor was supposed to be empty. The bearing on my scope was not empty. It was clean, tight, directional, not a natural source, and it was sitting on a frequency that no human ship had used since the Territorial Survey Commission retired the old pulseband standard in the early years of the expansion. I keyed my headset and said nothing for about 4 seconds, which is not like me. "Commander," I said, "I have a return bearing, frequency band 37 Alpha." Commander Yael Drestov was at the primary console with her back to me, reviewing the jump entry telemetry. She didn't turn around immediately, which told me she understood exactly what band 37 Alpha was. Band 37 Alpha was the navigation pulse standard we had retired. It was also the standard every human vessel from the first expansion wave had used for roughly 38 years before the Commission switched protocols. For 38 years, we had been broadcasting our position, our mass profile, our drive signature, and our heading on that band like a radio station that assumed no one was listening. Drestov turned around. Source: Deep Interior, bearing 271, elevation -8, range. I ran the figures twice because the first pass seemed wrong. It wasn't. Approximately 4 light minutes, stationary source, no drift. She walked to my console and looked at the scope herself. I watched her read the frequency tag, and I watched the small muscles around her eyes do the thing they do when a person recalibrates what kind of morning they are having. "Is it a beacon?" "It's a transmission," I said, "structured, not a carrier tone. There's content in there. I need time to pull it apart." "How much time?" "However long it is. It's large." She straightened up. "Get it? Nothing goes out on any band until I say." I spent the next 22 minutes pulling the Vethari transmission out of background and rendering it into a format I could read. I say rendering because what arrived was not a human encoding standard or anything close to one. It was translated. That was the word that kept arriving in my mind as I worked. It was a thing that had been deliberately rebuilt into a shape I could parse, which meant something had known what shape I would need. That was the second wrong thing, and it sat at the back of my neck the entire time. What I extracted was a file. Not a message, not a greeting or a warning or a territorial challenge. A file, a dossier, organized, indexed, containing sections with headers I could read because the headers were written in standard, which meant they had our language too, or at least enough of it to label things. The first section was titled, "Vessel Profile is Vive Grael's Margin," which hit me like cold water because we had been on the far side of the jump threshold 3 minutes ago. The second section was titled, "Human Union Fleet Disposition," which hit me like something worse than cold water, and I sat with my hands in my lap for a moment before I kept reading. I called Drestov over, and I showed her the index without commentary. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she said, very quietly, "Close the channel." "The channel is receive only," I said. "We're not broadcasting anything." "Then keep it that way." She went to her command console and pulled the crew to general stations without announcing why, which was the right call, because the why was the kind of thing that needed to be delivered carefully and not as a ship-wide alert tone. I stayed at signals, and I kept reading. The vessel profile section was precise. Our hull classification, our tonnage within a range of 3%, our drive type, our fuel consumption curve, our approximate crew complement, our jump range, listed not as a maximum figure, but as a distribution curve, showing the ranges we actually used in practice, which meant they hadn't just intercepted our beacons, they had tracked our stops. The Grael's margin had been in service for 11 years. The section contained data going back further than that, going back to our predecessor hull, the Grael's course, which had run this corridor approach 11 years before us, on a standard survey pass, and whose navigation pulse had been, I now understood, the first thing this compact had ever heard from humanity. Human Union fleet disposition was harder to read, not because it was inaccurate, but because it wasn't. It was organized by sector. It listed hull classes with designations that matched our own internal registry names, which we had never transmitted. What we had transmitted was drive signatures, mass profiles, and heading data, and something had inferred the rest, had looked at the shape of our signal, and worked backward to the thing that made the signal. The way you can reconstruct a hand from its shadow. Fleet counts were approximate, but in the right order of magnitude. Weapons classifications were listed as inferred, with confidence intervals noted in brackets. The confidence intervals were not comforting. 91% on our primary armament type, 87 on our point defense grid. I read for another 20 minutes. The file had a section on human biology, derived, I assumed, from the cultural and scientific signals we'd been leaking into the broader EM band for over a century, none of which was navigation data, but all of which was apparently receivable. A section on human governance, reasonably accurate at the broad level, with one annotation I had to read 3 times before I accepted that it said what it said, that human political structures, despite their documented instability at the local level, had produced a consistent strategic posture across 7 successive governmental changes, and that the Compact's analysts had concluded this consistency was not institutional but temperamental. A section on human psychology that I read twice and did not comment on aloud because I was not certain how to feel about being correctly summarized by something I had never met, and because 2 of the observations in that section were accurate in ways that I suspected would make Drestov uncomfortable if I read them to her out loud, so I did not. Then I reached the final section. It was labeled Assessment. The assessment section was 3 pages. It covered, in order, our strategic posture, which it characterized as expansionary but not predatory, a distinction it noted that many Compact members had contested, and which the file indicated had been settled by a majority adjudication 11 years prior, around the time the Grael's course had made its first survey pass. Our technical development curve, which it projected forward with confidence intervals, I found either impressive or alarming depending on the paragraph. Our diplomatic history with the species we had already encountered, which it evaluated as mixed but trending toward stable, and our pattern of behavior in contested space, which it assessed as rule-bound, given to calculated restraint, and resistant to preemptive action. All of that I could have written myself, more or less. We were not being told things we didn't know about ourselves. We were being shown that someone else knew them, which was a different experience. The final paragraph of the assessment was 4 sentences. I read them once. Then I read them again. Then I got up and walked to the command console and waited for Drestov to finish a quiet exchange with the navigation officer before she looked at me. "Last section," I said. "You should read it yourself." She came back to my console with me and stood at my shoulder and read the 4 sentences. I watched the back of her neck. The first sentence noted that the Vethari Compact had been monitoring human signal traffic for 38 standard years and had achieved what it termed comprehensive technical and strategic modeling of the human species, that their file on us was, by their assessment, complete. The second sentence noted that the Compact had identified what it termed 17 primary variables governing human behavior across strategic, diplomatic, and tactical contexts, and that 16 of those 17 had been derived reliably from signals intercept alone. The third sentence identified the 17th variable. It read, "The degree to which a human individual or crew will hold position under observation once they understand they are being observed, rather than withdrawing, broadcasting a challenge, or initiating contact. This variable," the sentence concluded, "could not be derived from signals. It required direct encounter." The fourth sentence read, "You have been holding position for 41 minutes. This is our answer." Drestov was quiet for a long time. Around us, the Grael's margin held station, 4 light minutes off whatever the Vethari Compact was using as its near-space anchor, something that didn't appear on our sensors with any kind of clean resolution, which meant it was very large, or very old, or both. The crew at their stations were doing what trained people do when the situation is genuinely unprecedented. They were watching their boards and keeping their hands off anything that would register as a hostile act. I thought about 38 years of navigation pulses going out into the dark on band 37 Alpha, every survey ship and patrol hull and freight runner that had ever crossed the near approaches to this corridor, humming their position into the void, without any real expectation that someone was filing it. 38 years of signal telling someone exactly what we were, where we went, how far we could go, and how much we weighed doing it. An accidental autobiography, a self-portrait painted in drive exhaust and timing intervals. The Vethari Compact had read every brushstroke, and they still hadn't known the one thing they needed to know, which was what we would do when we found out. "Morrow," Drestov said finally. "Commander, in your professional opinion," she paused, "is this a first contact or a file delivery?" I thought about that seriously, because she was asking seriously, and because the answer mattered. "I think," I said, "it's both. I think they've been waiting to see which word we'd use for it." She nodded once. "What do you recommend?" The Vethari's own assessment file told me what it expected us to do. It had laid out the confidence intervals for 4 possible responses. Withdraw and report, 63%. Open a hail and establish dialogue, 24%. No response, hold position, 9%. Something outside its modeling, 4%. We had already been in the 9% for 41 minutes. The question was whether we moved toward 24 or sat in the tail of the distribution a while longer. I looked at the 4th sentence again. "You have been holding position for 41 minutes. This is our answer." They weren't asking us to talk. They were telling us they had their answer already. The holding position was the data point they couldn't get from signals. We had given it to them by doing nothing, and they had transmitted to say, "Yes, this is what we thought you might do." We were right. Which meant the question wasn't what we did next. The question was whether we acknowledged that they were right. I pulled up a clean outbound channel on band 37 Alpha, the old standard, the one we'd retired, the one they'd been listening on for 38 years, the one they'd addressed us on, which I did not think was accidental. "One word," I said to Drestov. "No content beyond that." She looked at the channel indicator and then at me. "What word?" "Infirmed," I said. She held my gaze for a moment, then she nodded. I keyed the channel and sent it. One word on the old band. 11 years after the Grael's margin had first passed through this corridor and left its signal in the dark, and 38 years after the first human hull had done the same before us, and without any of them knowing they were doing it. Confirmed. The Vethari didn't respond. They didn't need to. Their transmission had said everything they had to say, and our one word had said everything we had to say back. And that was the first contact. Not the jump in, not the return bearing on my scope, not the file with its 91% confidence intervals. The first contact was 2 things that had been reading each other for 38 years, finally saying out loud that they knew. Drestov filed the incident report herself, which was unusual. That was normally my job. I didn't ask why. I think she wanted to be the one who wrote down what day it was. I stayed at my console and looked at the 4th sentence for a while longer. Then I closed the file and logged it into the ship's records under the Vethari contact header, and I sat back and thought about all those years of signal going out on that old band, and all those hulls that had carried it without knowing, and I found I couldn't decide whether we should be embarrassed that we'd been so easy to read, or proud that what they'd read had made them want to find out one thing more. In the end, I decided it was probably both. It usually is, with us.